Please state your full name.
Ernst Kaltenbrunner.
During the last 2 years of the war, from 1943 onwards, you were the head of the security police and the Secret Service, and the head of the Reich Main Security Office, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt. You are, of course, aware that extremely serious charges have been brought against you. These charges accuse you of committing crimes against peace, intentional assistance, incitement, or complicity in war crimes and crimes against humanity. And finally, the charges link your name to the terror of the Gestapo and the atrocities committed in concentration camps. I ask if you accept responsibility for the charges against you that you are aware of?
First, I wish to state to the tribunal that I am fully aware of the gravity of the charges against me. I am aware of the global hatred directed against me, for which I, especially since Himmler, Müller, and Pohl are already dead, must now stand alone before the world and the tribunal. I am aware that I must tell the truth in this courtroom so that the tribunal and the world can understand and fairly judge what has happened in Germany during this war. In 1943, that is 2 years before the end of this war, I was appointed to a position which I will explain in detail later. To begin with, I want to state that I assume responsibility for everything bad that was done within the framework of this office, because I was appointed head of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, and for everything that happened under my direct supervision, which means that I knew or should have known about it.
In general terms, briefly describe your career before entering public and Austrian political life, that is, up until 1934.
I was born in 1903. My father and grandfather were prominent lawyers. Otherwise, I was a farmer and labourer. My mother came from a humble background. She was adopted by the Belgian ambassador in Romania and lived there for 25 years. During my childhood, which I spent in the countryside with my family who cared for me well, I received both an excellent education and became familiar with the life of an ordinary man. I went to primary school, completed high school, and in 1921, I entered the University of Graz. Initially, I studied chemical engineering at the Institute of Technology, and later, when my father returned gravely ill from the war and the opportunity arose for me to take over his law practice, I studied law. I completed these studies with a doctorate in law and political science in 1926. I had a hard time. I had to earn my living and pay for my studies. I worked during my studies, and for 2 years I worked as a night shift miner. I am grateful to fate because in this way I came to know the German worker much better than usual.
Could you be brief? Please go as quickly as possible to the period after 1934.
After graduating from university, I spent 7 or 8 years working as a candidate for the bar under Austrian law, during which I spent 1 year as a judicial assistant and the rest of the time in law firms in Salzburg and Linz.
I will interrupt you now to ask a question. Is it correct that in 1932 you joined the party?
I joined the party in 1932, after several years in the non-partisan movement for the defense of the Austrian homeland.
Did you join the SS in the same year?
I believe it was at the end of 1932 or perhaps early 1933.
Is it true that, according to the indictment, you were already a spokesperson for the Gauleiter and legal advisor to the SS department before 1933?
This statement requires clarification. It is true that I spoke in my native province, Upper Austria, at National Socialist rallies, but primarily, or rather exclusively, to promote the Anschluss movement. During that period of economic emergency, I served as a legal advisor like any other lawyer for a party, volunteering to provide legal information and free advice for a few hours at the end of the working day to those in need, who, in this case, were National Socialists.
Is it true that later, in 1934, the government of Dollfuss detained you, and that you, along with other prominent National Socialists, were sent to the Kaisersteinbruch concentration camp? What was the reason?
Correct. I believe regarding this position that I should briefly describe the political situation in Austria at that time. The government was in the hands of a group of people who had little popular support. There were 2 main groups not represented in the government. The first was the left-wing group, i.e., the Social Democrats and Austro-Marxists, and the second was the National Socialists, who were then a very small group. The government then placed not only National Socialists, but also Social Democrats and Communists in its detention camps to eliminate any political conflict arising from rallies or demonstrations. I was one of the National Socialists detained at that time, whose number amounted to about 1,800.
Did you have another conflict with it? And were you finally tried for conspiracy against the government and subsequently released from the detention you were in? In a few sentences, explain the reasons for this proceeding.
That was much later. I was detained in May 1935. First, I must speak of the course of the National Socialist attempted uprising in Austria in 1934. This attempted uprising, which unfortunately included the assassination of Dollfuss, was defeated and avenged with the most brutal measures against many National Socialists. Another brutal measure was the law by which many thousands of National Socialists lost their jobs or their professional licenses, making it necessary to appease, I will say soften, the principles of government policy. This was primarily handled by two men, Langert, then deputy head of the National Socialists in Upper Austria, and Rheintaler, a farmer and engineer. Reconciliation actions began in late 1934, and in September or October I was invited to join them.
Please, in general terms, if possible, let's move on to the period before 1938.
I did not participate in this July 1934 uprising at all, which is why I was invited to join these reconciliation actions. As part of this program, the government itself demanded that certain people maintain ties with the leadership of the party, the SA, the SS, and all organizations of the then-banned movement. With the permission of the government and the relevant police departments, I established contact with the SS. In May 1935, I was detained on suspicion of having illegal ties with the SS and of treason. I remained detained for 6 months and was brought before a military court in Wels for a serious offence. However, I was acquitted of this offence because the government itself admitted that the task had been authorised with its knowledge. This resulted in a conviction for a minor offence, which nevertheless freed me from custody.
How did you participate in the Austrian Revolution that took place in March 1938? And how did the SS participate in it?
Shortly after my involvement in the Rheintaler-Langott reconciliation actions, I first entered the circles of the Anschluss movement clubs, and secondly, those circles aimed at peacefully changing conditions in Austria through an evolutionary movement and development, extending the Anschluss movement so that the government itself would lean towards this idea. In 1937 and 1938, I attempted to establish personal contact with Seyss Inquart, who later became a minister and fully embraced his political ideas.
Did you hold the opinion that the plebiscite held in Austria in April 1938 was in line with the nation's will?
The plebiscite on April 10, 1938, was entirely in accordance with the Austrian people's will. The result of 99.73% in favour of Anschluss with the German Reich was entirely authentic.
In relation to the Anschluss, is it true that you were promoted to SS Brigade Führer and head of the SS department?
Yes, but first, I want to add the following regarding the question of the Anschluss. The perspective and opinion of the prosecution are completely erroneous when they think that National Socialism in Austria at that time could be compared in any way with the development that took place in Germany. On the contrary, the development of Austrian National Socialism was entirely different. The starting point was the abnormal economic depression in Austria, followed by the Anschluss movement, and finally National Socialism made the Anschluss a reality. This journey from economic depression to the Anschluss to National Socialism was the general path for all National Socialists, and the party program's ideology was by no means responsible. It seems to me permissible, and I feel that I must say first and foremost that the Anschluss movement in Austria was supported by the people. However, it should be noted that a plebiscite in 1938 was not held. Various provinces, such as Tyrol or Salzburg, had already yielded a result of more than 90% in favour of the Anschluss in previous years, I believe from 1925 to 1928. Going back to 1928, the Austrian National Council and Federal Council signed the National Council Decree of 1918, which stated that both assemblies authorized joining the Reich. They did not repudiate this resolution.
Then, in September 1938, you were promoted to SS Gruppenführer, correct?
Yes. Following the subsequent Anschluss, I was entrusted with the leadership of the SS communities in Austria, specifically the main Danube division. Then I was promoted to brigade leader, not following the previous hierarchy of SS leaders. And I believe in September I was appointed Gruppenführer, so my rank became the same as that of all other leaders of the main divisions throughout the Reich.
May I ask you about your later career in the SS? Were you appointed in 1941 as the highest leader of the SS and police in Austria?
In March 1938, I joined the Austrian government. That is, I assumed the role of Secretary of State for Security in Austria, within the Ministry of the Interior. Then, in 1941, the Austrian government was dissolved. That is, it was ended in favor of the type of administration that prevailed in the Reich. Subsequently, the position of Secretary of State for Security was reduced, and to maintain the same budget level, I believe I was appointed Supreme Leader of the SS and Police in July 1941.
And on January 30th, 1943, as Chief of the Security Police and SD, that is, in the so-called Central Office for Reich Security. How did this appointment come about? Did you have contacts with Himmler? What did Himmler tell you about your appointment?
I must briefly describe my activities from 1941 to 1943, that is, the 2 years, as they explain why I was called to Berlin. The prosecution accuses me of having already been head of the security police in Austria. The prosecution is mistaken in this regard. The state police and criminal police, as well as the secret service in Austria, were administered directly from Berlin and were entirely outside the authority of Seyss-Inquart, then minister in charge, and his deputy Kaltenbrunner. My role as Supreme Leader of the SS and police in Austria, as opposed to the same positions in the Reich, was therefore simply limited to the task of representing or leading the General SS, which in no way occupied all my time. So, during those 2 years, I pursued my intentions concerning political activity and the development of a fairly large political intelligence service with a range from Austria to the southeast. I did this primarily because I regretted that the Reich was not utilizing the political and economic resources, all the resources Austria could make available to the Reich, and because the Reich, with incomparable short-sightedness, did not give Austria the more significant mission as an intermediary with the southeast. My reports thus generated intense interest in Berlin, and since Himmler was periodically reproached by Hitler that his intelligence service, which Heydrich managed in the Reich, did not produce adequate reports on political implications, Himmler, 8 months after Heydrich's death, felt compelled to find a man who could rid him of Hitler's reproach that his intelligence service lacked importance.
And what did you discuss with Himmler?
In December 1942, he ordered me to come to Berchtesgaden, where he was then because the Führer's headquarters were nearby in Obersalzberg. He first spoke to me about Hitler's reproaches and demanded that I establish a centralized intelligence service in the Reich. We had a long conversation about this topic, with reference to my previous intelligence activities in previous years. At that time, he felt that the best solution would be for me to accept the main office of Reich Security as a temporary basis for establishing such an intelligence service. I refused, citing detailed reasons, namely that I had maintained and observed Austria's critical stance towards the Reich's general development, especially in terms of domestic policy. I explained in detail to Himmler why the Germans in Austria were disillusioned, and what I saw as the danger that the same Austrians who had joined the Reich with enthusiasm 4 years earlier were becoming tired of the Reich.
Let me interrupt you now. Of course, it is correct that you were the head of the main office of Reich Security. Are you trying to say that you had no executive power?
I will address that directly. But now I must describe that first meeting with Himmler. The second took place 2 weeks later. On that occasion, I received an order, the first order I refer to, but I want to state right now, and this was a guiding principle throughout my career until the final days of the war, that I explained to Himmler back then the essential points on which I disagreed with National Socialism in terms of Reich domestic policy, foreign policy, ideology, and the government's violations of the law. I specifically declared to him that the Reich administration was also too centralized, that Austria had harshly criticized this centralized system, especially because federal status had been granted to the remaining states like Bavaria. I told him that the creation and application of a new German criminal law were flawed, and that German criminal law was casuistic. Austrian criminal law, based on over a century of tradition, was confirmed as the best and recognized abroad. I explained that in Austria, the concepts of preventive detention and concentration camps were not favored, and that everyone in Austria wanted to be brought before the court and the law. I explained that anti-Semitism in Austria had developed in an entirely different manner and required different leadership. I told him that in Austria, no one had thought of going beyond the limits of anti-Semitism established in the party program. I also said that it was hardly understood in Austria that the Nuremberg laws would go beyond the party program in this regard. In Austria, from 1934 onwards, Jews were allowed to emigrate peacefully under police supervision. Any personal or physical persecution of Jews was completely unnecessary. I refer to a document somewhere in the judicial record. It is a report from the Chief of Police of Vienna. dated, I believe, December 1939, which, according to statistics, confirms that from 1934 to 1939, I believe, just over half of the 200,000 Jews emigrated to foreign countries. These are the types of issues I discussed at that time.
And what did Himmler say to you?
And then I told Himmler that he knew very well that I had not only no training in police matters, but that all my activities up to that point had been in the field of political intelligence work, and that consequently, by accepting the office of Chief of Reich Security, I not only refused to have any executive authority over bodies such as the Gestapo and the criminal police, but the task he assigned to me, namely, establishing and developing the intelligence service, would in fact be nullified. I also said that I was personally extremely different from Heydrich, and that there were also material differences since Heydrich was an expert in political matters, while I was not, and that the policy he, Himmler, and Heydrich had already discredited the Reich with could not be carried out by me. My name, my honor, and my family were too sacred to me. He reassured me in this respect, saying, "You know that in June 1942, Heydrich was killed, and I myself, after his death, took charge of his department. This would continue as in the future, I will retain the executive departments. For this, I have the experts Müller and Neber. Don't worry about them. I am assigning you the intelligence service, that is, Departments 3 and 6, as a temporary framework for your intelligence service." I then told him that the intelligence service could not be built solely on the basis of the SD. The intelligence service had previously had a narrow focus, because Heydrich had increasingly involved it in executive work, which was unsuitable for intelligence gathering a priori. Secondly, I told him that the intelligence service should be smaller, and in particular it seemed absurd to me to separate political and military intelligence services. No country in the world, except Germany and France, had established a bipartite intelligence service division. Therefore, I demanded that he first obtain an order from the Führer under which the intelligence service of the armed forces, which was under the counterintelligence service of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, should be merged with the BOD, and a new staff for the agency should be selected and examined.
I will interrupt you now. Can you tell me in one sentence if the unification you mentioned took place?
Yes.
With Control VI?
Yes. And the other question, the unification was achieved by Hitler's order dated February 14th or 15th, 1944.
Then I ask you, after what you have just explained, did Himmler relieve you of your executive duties and communicate this to the other department heads within the Reich Security Main Office and to others that you were thus relieved? Was this relief from executive power visible from outside the department? If so, how?
After this meeting with Hitler in December 1942, he let me go because I did not want to accept the leadership of Reich Security under the conditions he offered, that is, with the executive department still managed by him as before. He was so angry with me that he didn't shake my hand and expressed his resentment in various ways in the following weeks. Around mid-January, on the 16th or 18th, I was ordered by telegram to report to headquarters, which at that time had been relocated to East Prussia. I assumed they would give me a frontline position because I had requested it. I went to headquarters with all frontline equipment because I thought that I was finally to meet the same fate as my brothers and male relatives, but I was wrong. He said to me, "I have spoken with the Führer, and the Führer is convinced that centralizing and reorganizing the intelligence service is the right course. He has initiated the necessary negotiations with the armed forces, and you will organize and build this intelligence service. I will keep Müller and Neber in charge of the executive departments." If you ask whether these restrictions were visible from outside the agency, my answer is that they were not published. Therefore, formally, the prosecution is correct in attributing, regarding the outside world, you never had a demarcation line. Therefore, I can say that I believed I could trust my superior officer's words. He told me this in the presence of Neber and Müller and gave them personal orders to contact him directly, report to him, and receive orders from him directly, as had been the case for 8 months after Heydrich's death. I categorically declare here that the special orders given to Heydrich, such as the order concerning the final solution to the Jewish question, were not only unknown to me, but were not transmitted to me. Nominally, I was chief of the Reich Security Main Office. As such, I considered the intelligence service and its reorganization my primary occupation, as I have stated before. Directives came from Himmler, but as I much later realized, matters were frequently handled in the state police and criminal police, in the name of the chief of the Reich Security Main Office, that is, in my name, without my being notified or familiar with the orders issued. The heads of the Gestapo and criminal police departments sometimes carried out Himmler's orders in such a way that they were also signed with my name as the head of the Reich Security Office, as I will probably explain in more detail later, thus continuing the routine custom of Heydrich's time, where all executive power was concentrated in his hands, and he could delegate authority to Müller and Neber. But I initially never had such authority, and therefore could not delegate any part of it. In this regard, I can probably add to my statement of responsibility that I may not have exercised the necessary care to make it clear that no order from the state police or criminal police should contain my name. The fact that I did not take sufficient care myself is partly Himmler's fault, but it is probably also my own fault.
I draw your attention to the testimony given here in court by Olendorf, Chief of Department III, on January 3, 1946. I will briefly present this testimony, and please feel free to comment on it. This testimony concerns an executive matter. Witness Olendorf said, in response to my question, "If you are asking whether Kaltenbrunner engaged in any executive actions, I can answer affirmatively. If you then name Müller and Himmler, excluding Kaltenbrunner, then I must point out that under the organization of the main office, Müller was a subordinate of the Reich Security Office. Kaltenbrunner, and therefore Himmler's orders to Müller, were also orders for Kaltenbrunner, and Müller was required to report them to Kaltenbrunner." And then, continuing, he said, "I can tell you that I know this perfectly." He addressed an expression that has often appeared, namely, "Hitler left the final decision in Himmler's hands to the very last straw." So whether Kaltenbrunner had authority in all this or not, I cannot say. Now I ask you, in essence, is Olendorf's statement correct?
It requires clarification. He is correct because nothing in the design or even in the organization of the main Reich Security Directorate had changed since Heydrich's time. Therefore, it could be assumed directly that there was an official Himmler-Kaltenbrunner-Müller channel. But during meetings, that is, when Himmler was giving orders, it was definitely not so. And regarding the other observation that Himmler reserved for himself the decisions on the final emptying, it confirms that the situation had indeed changed because, unlike in Heydrich's time, I, the intermediary between Himmler and Müller, was not active, which means Himmler's orders passed directly to Müller.
Now I will move on to the individual charges brought by the prosecution and first present you with a document for your statement. This is document L38, U.S. copy 517. It is now Kaltenbrunner 3. It refers to the accusation presented against Kaltenbrunner. The first question is whether all the preventive detention orders signed contained your name in facsimile or typewritten, and the second question is whether you issued these orders, and furthermore, if in both cases you respond negatively to the questions on whether you were aware of these orders. What is your opinion of this document?
I must say that at no time in my life have I seen or signed a preventive detention order. During pre-trial interrogations, when I was interviewed, I was shown several preventive detention orders. Each of these preventive detention orders had that signature, that is, my name, either in teletype or typewritten, and I believe in one or two cases as a facsimile.
You admit that, naturally, this statement of yours is not very credible. It is terrible that the head of an agency does not know what orders are signed with his name. How do you explain this fact, that it appears on documents containing your signature?
I have not finished my explanation. I said that the signature Kaltenbrunner on preventive detention orders could only have come about because the department head, Müller, signed on behalf of the chief of the Reich Central Security Office on these preventive detention orders, as he did in Heydrich's time when he was authorized to do so, and that he also gave instructions to his departments, for example, the Preventive Detention Department. Obviously, he continued doing this in my time, because otherwise these orders would not have been presented to me. But he never informed me of them, and never had authority from me. On the contrary, it was not discussed, and on the other hand, it was unnecessary because he was directly subordinate to Himmler and had authority from Himmler, which means he could simply sign Himmler or by order of Himmler or for Himmler. I acknowledge that this remains a fact about which the court may not believe me, but at the same time it was so, and Himmler never gave me any reason to inquire about my stance on this issue because he told me that I did not perform such executive tasks.
Do you mean that the use of your signature was illegal?
Müller had no authority from me to use it.
Were you aware that preventive detention was possible, that it was permitted, and that it was applied very frequently?
As I have said, I discussed the concept of preventive detention with Himmler as early as 1942. I believe that even before that, on 2 occasions, I corresponded on this concept in detail with him and with Tirach. I considered preventive detention, as it was administered in the German Reich, a future necessity in the interest of the state, or rather as a measure justified by the war, only in a small number of cases. Beyond this, I myself objected to and protested against the application of this concept of any preventive imprisonment on a matter of principle, and I often used historical legal arguments as justification for my reasoning. On several occasions I reported on this matter to Himmler and also to Hitler. In meetings with prosecutors, I think it was in 1944, I publicly expressed my opinion against it because I had always held the view that human freedom should be regarded as the highest privilege, and that only a court sentence firmly based on the Constitution should allow it to be restricted or diminished.
Now I will speak with you about the reasons given in these preventive detention orders. Among others, the following reasons were given: acts hostile to the Reich, dissemination of malicious rumors, insults, refusal to work, religious propaganda. Please express your opinion on the reasons for these preventive detention orders. Were they approved?
I thought these reasons for preventive detention were wrong. I will explain it in detail. My position was based on the fact that all the offences listed here should also be dealt with in judicial proceedings before state courts. For this reason, I considered preventive detention as such wrong, and even more so if the orders mentioned such reasons.
So, if I understood you correctly, I can summarize your position as follows. You mean that you did not know of the preventive detention orders, that you did not have the authority to issue them, and that you did not sign them, but since these preventive detention orders were issued in Department of V, you yourself should have known about them. Is this correct or not?
Yes.
Now let's move on to another charge against you. The prosecution accuses you of willful complicity in crimes committed in your capacity as head of the security police and the SD when the so-called Einsatzgruppen killed civilians and mistreated them. I will quote some phrases from the testimony given here before the court by witness Olendorf on January 3, 1946. Olendorf's testimony incriminates you.
As Olendorf described them, I was not aware of the existence of these Einsatzkommando. I later learned of their existence, but many months afterward. I want to say the following regarding this position. From Olendorf's testimony and from Hitler's and Himmler's orders discussed here, the court knows that orders were given to kill people. These Einsatzkommandos were not reorganized during my tenure. These Einsatzgruppen that were then in operation were also dissolved or transferred to another command before I took office. I do not know if the witness Olendorf stated when he returned from his Einsatzkommando.
1942.
Before I got the position, the Einsatzkommandos were supposed to answer to the highest SS and police leaders in the occupied territories, or, what is even more likely, to be subordinate to the heads of the anti-guerrilla units. I cannot answer your question accurately because, due to a year of imprisonment, I have not had the opportunity to review the organizational chart again. I believe you also asked me if I was aware that the valuables taken from those executed were sent to my office or the Reich Ministry of Finance. I know nothing of these supplies, but I do know that Himmler gave orders to everyone, not only to the security police, but also to the rest of the organizations in the occupied territories, whether the municipal police, the anti-guerrilla units, or those military units under his command, saying that all those goods should be delivered to the Ministry of Finance.
Were these orders the result of a Hitler order or an order from the Reich Chief Security Office?
They could only have been orders from Hitler.
You have already said that over time you became aware of the existence and importance of these Einsatzgruppen. Can you say exactly when you learned of them?
I believe it was when I was first received by Hitler, or perhaps it was the next day when I reported to Himmler in November of 1943.
1943?
Yes.
If you knew about the Einsatzgruppen and their importance at that time, then the question arises, what was your attitude toward them? In the event that they were condemned, what did you do to abolish them? Did you have the opportunity to do so or not?
I have already said that the Einsatzkommandos were never at my disposal or under my orders. The existence and prior activities of such Einsatzkommandos came to my knowledge in late autumn of 1943, and I realized I had to resist this illegal use of the men from the Reich Chief Security Office. I think on September 13th, 1943, I saw Hitler on a visit to Mussolini, who had just been freed. However, my attempt to speak to him on this matter failed due to this state visit. Later, in November, after Himmler had repeatedly postponed it, I returned to the headquarters to formally report on my activities at that time. And on this occasion, I spoke with the Führer about the actions of the Einsatzkommandos, which had become an issue. And not only that, but I also had the first opportunity to bring to his attention the entire Jewish problem and the orders given by him and Himmler against the Jews, which also came to my attention at that time. However, I would like to make a detailed statement on this topic if you intend to address it with me in detail. I am now imagining. I should just add that the Einsatzkommandos were no longer within the scope of what I was doing, because all the personnel were transferred to the anti-guerrilla fight, or even to the Supreme SS and police chief, I believe, on the very day I received my position in Berlin. I am sure that von Bach-Zelewski was appointed head of the anti-guerrilla fight on January 30th, 1943. Perhaps this is also the reason why I did not see any reports from the Einsatzkommando themselves.
Now I move on to another document, L51. This is an extremely incriminating document for you on which I would like to hear your comment. Sutter is the aide to the commander of the Mauthausen camp. He reported an execution order regarding 12 or 15 American paratroopers captured in 1945. Please look at the document and tell the court if you gave that order and if you had the authority to give it.
As I said once before, I never had the authority to sign so-called executive orders, that is, death sentences, with my signature and initiative. Apart from Hitler, no one in the entire Reich had that power, except Himmler and the Reich Minister of Justice.
Regarding this provision, I would like to point out that the prosecution has also presented executive orders containing Müller's signature. Do you have anything to say about this?
If the executive order contained Müller's signature, Müller had to sign based on Himmler's order, or based on the sentence issued by the court.
Does this mean that if Müller had the authority to sign executive orders, then you yourself had the same authority to a higher degree? Is that correct?
No, it is not, because Himmler never transferred such power to me. According to the established chain of command, the state police was under Himmler's orders after Heydrich's death, even after I took office. That was the contradiction.
The incident mentioned in this document is especially important because it involved foreign paratroopers, which implies in itself that it was known to the highest authorities in Berlin, that is, also by the Reich Central Security Office. Did you learn about it later? Did you have information about the detention of these prisoners? How long they stayed in the camps, their food rations, and how they were employed?
As I already mentioned, these penal labor camps were created to use detention for a period not exceeding 56 days. I believe even this was only possible after a person had been previously convicted of 3 similar offenses. Normally, detention in correctional labor camps.
The question was, did you know about the conditions in the camps? You have not answered at all. Please answer the question.
I believe you asked.
I asked if you knew anything about the maintenance, food, and employment of prisoners in the correctional labor camps.
I only knew that the correctional labor camps were tasked with performing work for public needs, that is, public construction, like road and railway maintenance, and especially repairing damage after air bombings. The prisoners from the correctional labor camps were seen by the entire population when they worked.
You still haven't answered the question.
I am asking you 3 specific questions. I want specific answers to those questions. Did you know anything about maintenance, food rations, and employment? Did you know, yes or no?
I said regarding employment.
Did you know?
Yes, the other 2 factors I did not know through personal observation.
Did officers from Division Mafri ever communicate it to you?
Not officers from Division 4. However, of course, the issue was constantly discussed within the National Intelligence Service, namely about the use of that labor for urgent work.
Did you never see any reason to interfere?
I had no reason to interfere in relation to the misuse of these camps, because no cases of violence in the camps were known.
This is a question about the persecution of Jews in Denmark. Do you wish to make any statement regarding that?
The sworn statement by Mildner read by you this morning is the only correct one.
Is that your statement?
I never had anything to do with the expulsion of Jews from Denmark. Such an order could only have been given by Himmler, and that it was a direct order given by Himmler is confirmed by Mildner.
Section C of question number 5 says that shortly after his return to Copenhagen, he received a direct order from Himmler sent through Kaltenbrunner as his superior.
Never did an order pass through my hands, and I never received such an order from Himmler. This is also quite impossible, because Denmark had its own supreme SS and police chief, who was Himmler's direct representative there, and who was directly subordinate to him, and not to the Reich Security Main Office. This supreme SS and police chief was at the same time the commander of the ZIPO. Organizationally, I could not give such an order to Denmark.
The prosecution holds you responsible for interning politically and racially undesirable persons in concentration camps. Were you aware of the concentration camps after your appointment as head of the Reich Security Main Office?
At the time of my appointment, I knew of 3 concentration camps. By the end of my mission, there were 12 throughout the Reich.
How many were there?
There were 13. There was an SS prisoner camp near Danzig. In total, 13 concentration camps in the entire Reich.
How do you explain the map you saw earlier with the numerous red dots referencing concentration camps?
Such a representation is certainly misleading. I have seen this map displayed here. All the armament centers, the factories where concentration camp prisoners were used as labor, were labeled as concentration camps. I can explain the dispersion of the red dots in no other way.
Do you distinguish between small camps and regular concentration camps, and if so, why?
The difference is obvious for the following reasons. Every worker employed in the war industry, that is, every prisoner, worked in the same company, in the same factory, as other German or foreign workers. The difference simply lay in the fact that the German worker returned to his family at the end of the workday, while the labor camp prisoner returned to the camp.
You are accused of having created the Mauthausen concentration camp and of visiting the camp continuously. The witness Holriegel, who testified here, said he saw you in the camp. He also reported seeing you inspecting the gas chambers in operation. There is the sworn statement by Sutter, also mentioned today, which stated that he saw you in the Mauthausen concentration camp. From this, the prosecution concludes that you must have also known exactly the degrading conditions for human dignity. I now ask you, is this testimony true or not? When did you inspect these camps, and what did you observe there?
The testimony is incorrect. I did not establish any concentration camp in Austria, where I was until 1943. I did not create any concentration camp in the Reich from 1943 onward. All concentration camps in the Reich, as is known today and has been accurately confirmed, were created by Himmler's order to Pole. This also applies, and I want to emphasize it, to the Mauthausen camp. Austrian authorities were not only excluded from the creation of the Mauthausen camp, but were also unpleasantly surprised because neither the concept of concentration camps in this sense existed in Austria, nor was there any need for concentration camps anywhere in Austria.
And now, in Germany, were you in the Reich?
What do you mean?
I am asking regarding information on the conditions there.
Gradually, I learned more and more about the conditions in the concentration camps. Apparently, I should have already learned about these things through the intelligence service throughout the Reich and its internal policy news channels.
Did you not see, as Holriegel testified, the gas chambers in action?
Never. Neither in operation nor at any other time have I seen a gas chamber.
Gradually, you became aware of the conditions in the concentration camps. That's what you said, right?
Yes.
Do you remember my last question?
No.
Did you see the gas chambers in action?
Yes, I have already answered that I never saw a gas chamber, neither in operation nor at any other time. I am aware of the fact that they existed in Mauthausen, and the evidence in this regard is completely wrong. I have never set foot in a detention camp in Mauthausen, that is, a real concentration camp. I have been in Mauthausen, but in a labor camp, not in a detention camp. The entire Mauthausen complex, as I recall today, covered an area of 6 kilometers. Within that area, there was probably a space of 4 or 5 kilometers of labor camps. They were the largest granite quarries in Austria and were owned by the city of Vienna.
The photograph shown here depicts you with Himmler and Zerreus.
I arrived at this point. The quarries were owned by the city of Vienna. The city of Vienna had a vital interest, including the supply of granite used to pave Vienna's streets. So, under Reich law, as I later learned, a large quarry was expropriated from the city of Vienna by the FWSH, Pole, and the city of Vienna was excluded from the granite supply for a time. The city approached me to complain to Himmler. It so happened that Himmler decided to visit and inspect southern Germany, and then chose to visit Austria and Mauthausen, and I requested to meet him there. That's how it came about that I was with Himmler at the quarry. Whether I was photographed or not at that time, I don't know. I haven't seen the photograph and can't say if I appear in it. I can add one more thing. Neither then nor at any other time did Himmler take me to a concentration camp or suggest that I do so. As I realized later, he had certain reasons for not doing it. I did not attend such inspections because I knew very well that he would do to me what he did to others he invited on such visits, showing me Potemkin villages instead of the actual conditions. With the exception of FWHA subordinates, no one was ever allowed to see things as they truly were in the concentration camps.
Then may I ask you, you speak of the beggars, were you not part of that group?
Number those infiltrated men were Himmler, Pohl, Müller, Glücks, and the camp commanders.
If I understand correctly, you want to mention the investigation regarding Professor Burkhardt's visit to the concentration camps as a mitigating circumstance.
Yes, certainly, but I want to discuss it in detail later, as it's early now.
The prosecution stated that 2 concentration camps were established after you took office, Lublin and Herzogenbusch. Have you heard anything about this? Who ordered the creation of these 2 camps?
I am unaware of the dates of creation of these 2 camps. Lublin and Herzogenbusch were subordinated through the FWHA channels to the Supreme SS and police leaders of the occupied countries where they were located, which means that the Berlin headquarters had nothing to do with them.
Then please answer yes or no to this question. Do you know the Auschwitz concentration camp as such?
No, I did not learn about it until November 1943.
At the same time you learned of the camp's existence, were you informed of its significance, namely, that it was exclusively a Jewish extermination camp run by Eichmann?
No, it was not known to anyone as such. When asked why there was such a large camp there, Himmler always responded, because there are large military industries nearby, and I believe he mentioned Witkowitz and others. In any case, and I think this should be emphasized, there was total secrecy about what was happening at Auschwitz, which means that statements not only by the defendants but also by anyone else who was questioned. I knew Eichmann in Linz, my hometown. The prosecution claims, and today has tried to demonstrate through sworn statements, that I was a friend, or at least an intimate acquaintance of Eichmann. I want to make the following statement on this matter, referring in particular to my oath. I have a high regard for what a close friendship means. I became aware of Eichmann in Linz because his father, as the director of Linz's electric company, was consulted by my father as a lawyer, and so they knew each other, and because he, his father's son, attended the same school as my brothers. Thus, Hottel's claim that I met Eichmann in the SS detachment in Linz is incorrect, because by the time I joined the SS, Eichmann had already left for Germany, as I later learned. Secondly, the prosecution claims that I met Eichmann in 1932 and a second time in February or March 1945. Consequently, I did not see him for 13 years and did not see him again after that last encounter. Based on these 2 personal encounters, I can conclude that I am neither his friend nor did we know each other intimately. At the second encounter, he did remind me, saying, "Obergruppenführer, my name is Eichmann, I also come from Linz." I said, "Nice to meet you. How is everything back home?" But there was no official contact.
Witness Lammers testified yesterday about a meeting at the Reich Security main office regarding the so-called final solution. Are you aware of it?
Number, I believe, Witness Lammers, and also another witness, testified that Eichmann, perhaps in my name, convened a meeting at the Reich Security main office in Berlin in February or March 1943 for the so-called meeting of the Reich Security main office. I'll say that nominally I was on duty in Berlin from January 30th, but in fact until May I was not in Berlin, except for some official visits, but was in Vienna, where I was strengthening my intelligence service with a view to transferring it to Berlin.
One more question. When did you first hear that the Auschwitz camp was an extermination camp?
Himmler told me in 1944 in February or March. That is, he didn't tell me, he admitted it.
What was your attitude upon realizing this?
I didn't hear the question.
What attitude did you take upon learning this?
When I assumed office, I was unaware of Hitler's order to Heydrich about the final solution to the Jewish question. In the summer of 1943, I learned about it through foreign press and enemy radio.
Please try to give me a direct answer to this question. What was your attitude after hearing what you heard? Answer very briefly and concisely, please.
Immediately after becoming aware of this fact, I fought, as I had previously, not only against the final solution, but also against this type of treatment of the Jewish issue. For this reason, I wanted to explain how I became familiar with the Jewish question in general through my intelligence service and what I did against it.
We still don't know what you did. What were you doing? I'm asking you for the last time.
To explain what I was doing, I have to explain now how I reacted by recounting what I heard on the matter.
Explain your reaction to us.
I protested first to Hitler and the next day to Himmler. I not only brought to their attention my personal stance and the completely different perspective I brought from Austria with my humanitarian principles, but also immediately from the first day, I concluded that almost all the reports I received until the end stated that no hostile power would negotiate with a Reich guilty of this. I presented these reports to Himmler and Hitler in particular, also pointing out that the intelligence department could create an atmosphere conducive to negotiations with the enemy.
When did the persecution of the Jews cease?
October 1944.
Are you saying this was the result of your intervention?
I am firmly convinced it was primarily due to my intervention, although others were also working in the same direction. But I don't believe anyone else buzzed in Himmler's ear at every meeting with him, or spoke as openly, frankly, and selflessly with Hitler as I did.
Was this instruction to Eichmann an instruction from Hitler to Himmler and the Reich Security Main Office, and then to Eichmann, or strictly a personal order outside the Reich Security Main Office's jurisdiction?
Naturally, today I can only reconstruct the situation since I was not there when the orders were given. But I have reasons to believe that the channel of this order was Hitler, Heydrich, Eichmann, and that Himmler, shortly after Heydrich's death, continued to work with Eichmann, likely very often even excluding Müller.
Witness Wislicheny, who was questioned here, and I will present this to you, stated on January 3rd that practically the final decision was carried out between April 1942 and October 1944. Wislicheny referred to a personal order from Himmler and continued stating that Eichmann was personally responsible for this task. But he continued saying, "The extermination of the Jews continued under Kaltenbrunner without reduction or mitigation." The reports made by Eichmann in this regard at regular intervals were sent to Kaltenbrunner through Müller. Here it is stated that in 1944, Eichmann was personally summoned by Kaltenbrunner, and Wislicheny confirmed that he had seen Kaltenbrunner's signature on those reports to Himmler. That was Wislicheny's testimony. Now my question is this testimony accurate in essential points?
The testimony is incorrect, but I can clarify it. Wislicheny may have once seen my signature, not on the report to Himmler I received from Eichmann and Müller, but on a letter I wrote to Himmler, a copy of which I sent to Müller and Eichmann for their information, and in which I referred to my last report, a verbal report to Himmler on the Jewish question. The reason was that it was the first time I had heard about Eichmann's activities in this regard, and to make it clear to Eichmann that I did not wish to be associated with those activities, I gave Müller a copy of the letter to Himmler. In this letter, I asked Himmler to clarify his position on this matter, since the Führer had once again ordered me to inform him. I could provide the Führer with a full report on Himmler's activities and therefore requested a prompt decision.
Witness Hodel stated in his affidavit that he heard Eichmann say that a total of 4 to 5 million Jewish people were exterminated, around 2 million of them in Auschwitz. Have you heard of such numbers?
I've never heard of such numbers, but I criticized Himmler on this point and asked him to consider the extent of such crimes. The reason I asked him was to make him realize the magnitude of the catastrophe that was ensuing. He responded that he had no figures. It didn't seem so to me. I'm sure he had them.
Do you wish to take responsibility for it or deny it?
So I categorically, completely deny it because I hope I can confirm through Burkhardt that no one spoke so strongly on this matter.
Now I move to document 2990, PS, copy number US 526. This is the sworn statement of witness Shellenberg. According to it, in 1944, a meeting took place between Kaltenbrunner and Müller. Kaltenbrunner supposedly stated that the public action against terrorist pilots should not concern him, that, on the contrary, public hostility should be encouraged. Do you know Shellenberg?
Regarding Shellenberg, I have to say,
in a few sentences, please.
Referring to his credibility in the document, he was Heydrich's protégé, and when I obtained the position, he was in charge.
He wants to know if you know Shellenberg. You can answer that question. The question was, do you know Shellenberg? And he went on with a lengthy speech without answering the question.
Do you know Shellenberg? Yes or no?
Yes, of course, he was the head of Division 6.
My question is, what was the relationship between you and the head of Department Thies? Do you consider that statement accurate or not?
This statement is not accurate, and I must give reasons for the court to assess this statement. Shellenberg was Himmler's closest friend. By Himmler's order, he stayed with him until the very end. He was the man who, by Himmler's order, established contact with Swedish Count Bernadotte. He was the man who, at the last moment, through Herr Mouchet in Switzerland, established a connection that allowed a few Jewish prisoners to go to Switzerland, with the purpose of quickly creating a favorable impression of Himmler and Shellenberg abroad. He is the man who, along with another friend of Himmler's, initiated action to reach an agreement with a rabbinic organization in the United States, as a result of which they were to receive favorable press coverage in major American newspapers. I criticized Himmler for these tricks and complained and discredited them before Hitler, telling him they had discredited and humiliated the Reich by the methods used by Himmler and Shellenberg in such an important matter. I told him that the only appropriate route was to establish contact with the International Red Cross. Subsequently, I warned President Burkhardt about Himmler, and I forced him to take a different stance on this matter by asking Burkhardt to personally visit these camps.
But I asked you a completely different question.
Yes, but I said it to show you how disappointed Shellenberg and Himmler were with what I did in the affidavit, and why it was in his interest to accuse me of breaking my word in international matters.
In other words, you mean to say that Shellenberg was opposed to you, and in doing so, acted unjustly against you?
Yes.
So, in this document, Shellenberg mentions the incident involving these 50 airmen, and Shellenberg states that you, along with Miller and Noba, held a meeting and tried to find justification for the order in order to hide the real truth of these events from the public. I ask you, when did you first learn of the shooting of these 50 airmen? This is the Sagan case. When did you learn about this? It's a simple question, please.
I learned about this case about 6 weeks after it happened.
My next question is, are you saying that you did not participate in the matter in any way which contradicts the fact that you could later investigate the matter?
Yes, that is what I am saying.
Are you saying that the meeting with Shellenberg only referred to a later attempt to establish the truth of the matter?
It can only refer to that.
I now turn to another document, number 1573 PS, USA 498. The accusation is that the head of the Reich Security Main Office is responsible for changing the existing methods of using slave labor in the armaments industry. This document before us is a secret order, once again signed first by Miller. It is addressed to all police service departments. The date is June 18, 1941. The order referred to measures against immigrants and civilian workers from Russian territories. It stated that, to prevent unauthorized returns and any influence on their part, those responsible would be detained if reasons arose. Until further notice, these people were not allowed to change their place of residence without permission from the security police, and if they left their workplace without permission, they were detained. Were you aware of such events?
No.
How can you explain that Miller was in a position to exercise such power, and that even within your service, 1943 to 45, this explains your inability to stop this man? Therefore, I now ask, were you generally aware that Miller had such power? In this regard, could you tell the court what the size of the secret state police directorate IMV was, and how you explain that you were not informed of hundreds or even thousands of orders and instructions?
Müller was the head of the secret state police department. I don't know when he was appointed, but I must assume it was in 1933, 1934, or later in 1935. But much earlier, as I know today, he had the closest contact with Himmler and later with Heydrich. He came from the Bavarian Land Police, where Himmler had known him. He had his personal trust for at least 12 or 15 years. He participated in and carried out all actions that Himmler ordered in the field of state police at the height of his power or in pursuing his goals as chief of the German police. I can say that this trust grew steadily over a period of 12 or 15 years and remained inviolable until the last days of the war. Müller remained in Berlin and had orders to stay with Himmler. Himmler saw him as his blind and trusted instrument.
Answer the question briefly and clearly.
The relationship between Himmler and Müller was so direct that he had no reason to report to me. He had information, and until December of 1942, Himmler clearly stated that the heads of Directorates 4 and 5 were his direct subordinates, as happened after Heydrich's death.
So it is still charged that, based on certain witness statements and other evidence, it must be assumed that there were meetings between you and Müller and department heads, and that it does not seem conclusive that you generally did not know about the things Müller pointed out. Is that charge justified?
That seems justified, but it was not. What was called a department head meeting was a general lunch, not held daily but say 3 or 4 times a week. General lunches for aides, department heads, and any guest who might be in Berlin at the time. This very personal setting made it impossible to discuss internal or even secret events in front of all these people.
In 1943 and the following years, were you always in Berlin? Or I think I should say, were you more of a Berlin resident? Or did your work as intelligence chief often require you to leave Berlin?
I was often away from Berlin. I think I can say that half of my total work time was spent outside Berlin. I was only permanently in Berlin after the headquarters was moved here.
When was that?
This was in the months of February and March of 1945. I wasn't in Berlin even in April 1945, during 2 long periods from March 28th to April 15th, and then from April 19th until the last days of the war. During the years 1943 and 1944, I didn't arrive in Berlin until May of 1943 because I was then reorganizing my services in Vienna to transfer them to Berlin. I think only during the 1st or 2nd week of February 1943 did I stay in Berlin for a visit, and from mid-February 1943 until February 1945, I traveled at least half the time. I covered more than 400,000 kilometers by plane and car as part of my duties.
What did you do while you were in Berlin? Did you have no direct contact with Müller at that time?
Certainly not with Müller. During all these travels around the Reich, I never entered any state-secret police department, except for the state-secret police department in Linz, where my family moved shortly after, and from which I used to send teletype messages to Berlin, using the local state police station for purely technical reasons. There I had no other teletype service.
Now I will speak about the matter you are charged with. In short, it concerns the following facts. During the repression of the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, the inhabitants of the city of Warsaw were sent to concentration camps. The prosecution presented figures from 50,000 to 60,000. The deportations were supposed to be reduced due to the intervention of the accused Frank before Himmler. You personally participated in the fact that the accused Frank and his Secretary of State Bühler asked you to release these people from concentration camps and return them to their homes. To begin with, I ask you, was such a meeting held on this matter in your department?
There was a meeting between Bühler and me. The subject was something very different, and I ask that you allow me to clarify it. The so-called Warsaw Uprising was repressed by purely military means. I believe it was fought under the command of the head of the anti-guerrilla units, Bach-Zalewski. I don't know what combat units he commanded, but I must assume they were mixed units of armed forces and police. Any involvement of my department in this purely military action was out of place. Naturally, what Himmler and his military units did to the prisoners was not communicated to me. The reason Bühler came to see me was very different. Frank had been trying, I think for a year and a half or even earlier, to compel Hitler to follow a different policy in the general government. Frank was in favor of increasing the autonomy of the Polish people. In October 1944, I believe during the Polish banking holidays, Frank planned to announce an increase in autonomy. Hitler refused, with the support of Himmler and other factors. Consequently, he sent Bühler to me with the proposal that I make a proposal through the intelligence service in the same sense, namely for the participation of Poles in district government and other government offices. I promised Bühler both things. He set off, saying, on this occasion, Frank wants a generous amnesty to be declared in Poland, and to include the release of prisoners from the Warsaw Uprising. Could you help in this endeavor? I asked. Where are the prisoners? He replied, Himmler is handling the matter by sending them to prisoner of war camps. My response might have been, then he has to use them in the war industry in any case, and it will be difficult to receive them. But I am inclined toward amnesty. Based on my information, this is the state of the matter.
In the speech Himmler gave on October 3, 1943, in Posen before the top leaders of the SS and police, you were named Heydrich's successor. The prosecution believes this is confirmation of your full executive authority and extraordinary powers in this field. Does the situation justify or not justify this formal expression used precisely in this context?
No, I categorically protest, as I did during all interrogations, against being called Heydrich's successor. If in my absence Himmler referred to me as such, or if he once made a comment or announcement of this kind published in the press, then it was done without my knowledge and against my will. The first time in relation to this press announcement, there was a harsh reaction on my part against Himmler. The day you mention here, I was ill in Berlin with inflamed veins and in a cast, so I did not join the discussion. Neither the scope of my power nor my outward presence provided the slightest possibility of comparing me to Heydrich. I will now briefly say that until the last day of my work, I received 1,820 Reichsmarks, which were the earnings of a police general, while Heydrich earned over 30,000 Reichsmarks, not because he was paid for his higher rank, but as recognition of his completely different position. Either comparison is entirely inappropriate.
Then my next question is it true that Himmler feared Heydrich, and that because of this, Heydrich, in his view, had too much power, which is why he came up with the idea of appointing you to find a man who would be completely secure for him, Himmler? In this regard, the prosecution established a parallel between you and Heydrich, and as I said before, they described you as a second Heydrich.
The relationship between Himmler and Heydrich can be summarized as follows. Heydrich was the more intelligent of the two. At first, he was unusually obedient and loyal.
In that case, I'll repeat the question I asked earlier, which is this. Did Himmler, in appointing you, want a man who would be perfectly secure for him, Himmler?
He never again wanted to release such executive power to the extent that Heydrich had. Upon Heydrich's death, Himmler took over the entire department, and afterward did not allow executive power to leave his hands. He had once experienced the danger that the head of the security police could represent in the person of Heydrich. He didn't want to allow the risk a second time.
In other words, with this, do you finally mean that after Heydrich's death, Himmler wanted and kept all executive power in his own hands?
Yes.
One more question. Yesterday, you stated that you became aware of the concept of the so-called final solution later on. Regarding such instructions sent by Himmler to Heydrich and Eichmann before 1941 or 1942, is it true that you saw Himmler often? Were you friends with Himmler?
It is a complete mistake to describe my relationship with Himmler as friendly. Just as with any other official, he treated me in an extremely cold and reserved manner. He was not a man capable of forming personal relationships with anyone.
It is natural to assume, if I put myself in the place of the prosecution, that you must have had knowledge of the final solution and this idea if you saw Himmler often. Therefore, I ask you again, did Himmler ever explain to you what final solution meant?
No, not in that way. I said yesterday that based on all the information gathered during the summer and fall of 1943, including reports on enemy broadcasts and foreign news, I came to the conviction that the statements about the extermination of the Jews were true. And thus convinced, I immediately went to Hitler and the next day to Himmler, complaining to both, saying that I did not support such actions for a single minute. From that moment.
According to your testimony, in 1932, you joined the Austrian SS.
Yes.
Were there differences between the Austrian SS and the German SS, or were they similar groups?
There was a certain organizational similarity that only became apparent after the Anschluss. Until the Anschluss, it was difficult to distinguish the SS in Austria from the party itself or from the SA itself.
Summarize the strength level of the Austrian SS to which you belonged. First, before the Austrian Anschluss in 1938, and then at the time when you enlisted. How did it develop roughly? State the figures.
That's too fast.
Did the development of the Austrian SS to which you belonged occur both in 1938 and in 1932?
It seems to me that at the time of the Austrian Anschluss, the maximum number of members was 7,500.
Did this group play the role of a fifth column in Austria? Was the concept of fifth column associated with it?
Yes, fifth column became a concept for me through enemy statements, but the term fifth column for the Austrian SS is entirely incorrect. The Austrian SS never had the task of being an intelligence or sabotage unit or anything like that.
Was there the slightest intention within the Austrian SS to which you belonged to forcefully annex Austria to Germany, or was this to be achieved through a plebiscite by legal means?
The SS had no annexation plan, nor do the facts of political developments confirm this. There was never a need for such a step. The Anschluss movement, without any external threat, was strong enough on its own.
It is alleged that SS Standard 86, should it have been in Vienna.
Are you referring to the Dollfuss Putsch?
Correct. Can you tell us anything about it? Did the activities of this unit have any connection with the assassination of the Austrian Chancellor?
I believe that is incorrect. I must say that this unit was not later numbered 86 or 89. Additionally, the group that entered the Chancellery on July 25, 1950-34, was not an SS group, but a group of former Austrian army members who, due to their National Socialist activities, had been dismissed from the army. I do not know the matter in detail. However, the then chief of the Austrian police, Dr. Skubel, who as far as I know was called as a witness in another case, could provide accurate information on the matter. I urge you to ask him about it.
Try to recall the entry of troops on the night of March 11th, 1938. What type of troops entered, according to your memory? I ask, were they SS units or other units? Were they army units? Were they SS troops? What do you remember?
My recollection is that first there were Wehrmacht units, of course the Luftwaffe, and there was a regiment of the Waffen SS. I don't remember which, probably the Germania regiment that participated in the entry.
Can you roughly compare the size of the Wehrmacht and the Germania regiment?
The Germania regiment probably had about 2,800 men at that time. As for the Wehrmacht, I don't know how many units participated.
To establish the proportion, and according to your understanding, what was the total number of SS members? I want to simplify this. I have seen reports stating that between 750,000 and 1 million people passed through the SS during the entire period. Is that figure correct?
1 million is definitely too high. All branches of the SS together, including the General SS, the Waffen SS, and including SS members in various police services, I believe, totaled between 720,000 and 750,000 men. Of that number, at least between 320,000 and 350,000 were killed. These losses are likely even higher than I have stated, but I believe more accurate figures can be obtained from one of the accused in the Wehrmacht. I do not know exactly.
Based on your information, how many people from the total number do you relate specifically to concentration camps? That is, to supervision, administration, etc. Can you give me numbers on how many were connected?
This is an unexpected question for me. I cannot answer immediately. I need pencil and paper to make calculations.
Can you, based on your information?
Of course, it's only a fraction, a very small fraction of the total.
Those SS members, however many or few they were they not related to the administration of the concentration camps and supervised the conditions or the administration and events occurring in the camps?
Definitely not.
How can you speak with such certainty?
As far as I know personally, Himmler and his organization kept concentration camps behind the Iron Curtain.
Were there members from the department you directed, for example, the Reich Security Main Office, recruited only from the SS or predominantly from the SS?
No, not all of them. The proportion of SS members to non-SS members was about 5%, if we consider only the central office staff of the SD within Germany.
So, out of every 100 employees, 5% were part of the SS?
Yes.
According to your information, were rules prohibiting physical mistreatment of prisoners in concentration camps known to the SS?
They were printed. That is, they appeared in all the Reichsführer SS and German police chief newspapers. All SS members knew that these rules were laws, and they severely punished any known mistreatment. I don't know to what extent or condition the disciplinary camp in Danzig-Matzgau fell into enemy hands, but I am convinced that anyone who has served there will provide information about the severe punishment for mistreatment.
Defendant, to shorten this cross-examination as much as possible, I want to ensure we understand each other regarding your stance on some matters. So first, you admit that you held the position of Chief of the Reich Security Main Office and Chief of Security Police in SD from the end of 1943 until the end of the war. Is that correct?
Yes, with the restrictions I listed yesterday regarding my powers over the state and criminal police.
And when you speak of these restrictions, you refer to the supposed agreement with Himmler. Is that correct?
It was not a supposed agreement with Himmler, but a well-established fact that existed from day one. That I was tasked with creating a centralized intelligence service in the Reich, and he retained command over the other sectors.
Well, in any case, you admit that you held that position, but deny that you exercised some of its powers. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the position you held was the same one previously held by Heydrich, who died on June 4th, 1942. Is that correct?
Yes.
The position did not change?
No.
And you testified that you accept responsibility for all things you did personally or knew personally. Is that correct?
Yes. I must add that my position was expanded from February 14th, 1944, when the Military Intelligence Service of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the Counterintelligence Department, was transferred to Himmler by Hitler. Then my role as head of the entire Central Intelligence Service became known to the other departments. I can probably also add that the position of a person, or their functions in the intelligence service, which covered not only a country as large as the Reich, but also extended to foreign countries, was not public. I can refer to England, where the head of the Secret Service over others.
Defendant, please try to limit yourself as much as possible to answering my questions with yes or no and giving only a brief explanation, as we will get to these things in due time. Will you try?
Yes, agreed.
Did you personally know of the atrocities that took place in the concentration camps during the war?
No.
And therefore you do not accept responsibility before the tribunal for any of those atrocities. Is that correct?
No, I have not admitted responsibility for that.
And concerning this, do you deny testimonies such as that given here, for example, by Hohlriegel regarding you being an eyewitness to executions in Mauthausen? Is that correct?
I already spoke yesterday about Hohlriegel's testimony. I consider the claim that I saw the gas chamber in action or otherwise to be wrong and incorrect.
Very well. You personally had no knowledge and did nothing personally about the Jewish extermination program, except to oppose it. Is that correct?
No, except that I opposed it. From the moment I learned of such facts and became convinced of them, I raised objections to Hitler and Himmler, and it was ultimately stopped.
And therefore you do not accept responsibility for anything done concerning the Jewish extermination program, correct?
Yes.
And the same applies to the forced labor program? And the same applies to the forced labor program?
Yes.
And the same does not apply to the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto?
Yes.
And it also refers to the execution of 50 pilots in connection with Stalag Aviation III?
Yes.
And it also refers to the various orders regarding the killing of enemy airmen, correct?
Yes.
And as a matter of fact, you cited the same denials during your pre-trial interrogation, correct?
Yes.
And are you still saying so now?
Yes. But regarding the preliminary interrogation, may I make a statement during the cross-examination?
Well, when we reach a suitable point, let us know. Is it a fact or not that the Gestapo, Department of 4, Reichssicherheitshauptamt prepared reports on the concentration camps that were presented to you for your signature and transmission to Himmler?
Number, I don't recall any such report. The usual channel was for Müller to report directly to Himmler.
You also deny. Defendant, let's return to the Warsaw Ghetto. You recall from your testimony before this tribunal that about 400,000 Jews were initially placed in the ghetto, and then, through a final action, SS troops expelled around 56,000, of whom more than 14,000 were killed. Do you remember that testimony?
Number, I don't remember any details of that statement. I have already stated today that I'm aware of the matter.
Are you aware that later all those 400,000 Jews were killed at the Treblinka extermination plant? Are you aware of that?
No.
What did you have to do with the final destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto? As always, nothing.
I had nothing to do with it, as I've already said.
I ask that document number 3840 PS, which will be copy number US 803, be shown to the defendant. Do you know Karl Kaleski?
No, I do not know that name.
Would it help you remember if I suggested that he was General Stroop's assistant?
I don't know General Stroop's assistant. The name you mentioned, Kaleski, I also do not know.
Let's move to the affidavit. Do you have it?
Yes.
Are these statements true or false, defendant?
These statements are, without exception, incorrect.
Like the rest of the statements of the other individuals read today? Is that correct?
The statement is not correct. It is not true and can be refuted.
That's what you've said about all the other statements read to you today, isn't it?
Mr. Prosecutor, I must...
Isn't it true?
Yes. If they make false accusations against me, I must declare them false. I cannot say yes to everything I'm accused of simply because the prosecution has mistaken who Himmler's representative is here.
Okay, go ahead, start and say what you want to say.
I ask that you take into account what I have said about the authority and regulations regarding the subordination of all high-ranking SS and police leaders in the occupied territories. They were all directly subordinated to Himmler. The SS and police chiefs of a small territory were subordinated to the Supreme SS and police chief. The divisions of the Order and Security Police were attached to these SS and police chiefs who had the exclusive right to give them orders. The entire organization in the occupied territories, managed in this way, was excluded from the command jurisdiction of the Reich Central Command. There are people here who can attest to the truth of what I've said. Bach-Zelewski, who was interviewed here, was only in the occupied territories and knew the conditions there. Also, there is the defendant Frank, who worked with a high-ranking SS and police leader who later became Secretary of State.
Your defense lawyer can call these people. All I asked was if this document was true or false, and then I asked you to give any brief explanation you wanted.
This document is not correct.
We know of potential witnesses in Germany, and we know that all these defendants on the bench know of most of these cases, but that's not what I'm asking about. I'm just asking if what appears in the newspaper was true or false, and you said it was false. So, would you like to say so?
He is mistaken, and this witness did not know.
Well, you've said that 6 times.
Without knowing the conditions.
And what about General Stroop? Does he know anything about this?
If he was the SS and police chief of Warsaw, and also showed me his diary and his film report, then of course, yes. Stroop was subordinated to the Supreme SS and police leader on the site. Stroop carried out the action on Himmler's orders through the Supreme SS and police leader.
Stroop was a good friend of yours, wasn't he?
I probably saw Stroop no more than 2 or 3 times in my life, at the Reichsführer Himmler's residence.
Well, if Stroop is here, he is at least in a position to tell the truth about the Warsaw Ghetto affair, isn't he?
He will confirm my statement, at the very least, that he was subordinated to the Supreme SS and police leader in the general government and was not subordinated to me. I would be glad if he confirmed it immediately. From what you're saying, I must assume he's being held here.
Okay, defendant. Now, do you recall the testimony given to the tribunal about efforts made by Germany to incite the Slovaks to rebel against Czechoslovakia, and that Hitler used the Slovak Uprising as one of the justifications for the occupation of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939?
I don't know who testified to that.
Well, in any case, from 1938 to 1939, it is a fact, isn't it, that you were Secretary of State for Security in Austria? Is that correct?
No, I was not Secretary of State for Security Police. I was Secretary of State for the security system in the Austrian government in Vienna, and there is a significant difference because the security police in Austria were formed and managed from Berlin.
All right.
And in Austria, I had no influence, nor did my minister over the security police.
When did you become the Supreme SS and police leader in Upper Austria, with headquarters in Berlin?
This is a complete distortion. There was no Supreme SS and police leader in Upper Austria, only in Austria.
Well, when was that?
This was after the liquidation of the Austrian government, and after these issues were resolved. This can be determined precisely from the Reichsgesetzblatt. It was probably in the summer of 1941.
And isn't it a fact that you yourself directed the activities of the Slovak rebels and helped them with explosives and weapons? Answer yes or no, please.
No.
Do you recall participating in any meeting regarding the sedition plan in Slovakia?
That is not correct. I did not participate in any such instigation in Slovakia. I did not participate in the initial government meetings in Slovakia, nor in the presence of a German Reich delegate.
Did your friend Spatsil help you with those plans?
I don't remember that today. In any case, they were not German plans. If you examine the political situation in Slovakia at that time, you will clearly see that no incitement from the German Reich was required. It seems to me that the Glinkovo movement, under the direction of Dr. Tukey and also Dr. Tiso, was decided much later.
Now, defendant, you testified that you had no knowledge of the fact that the Einsatzgruppen of the security police and SD had been operating for a long period in the USSR territory after you became head of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt in January of 43. Is that incorrect?
Yes.
And you're still saying that, correct?
Yes.
Do you deny that you learned that these Einsatzgruppen were carrying out the extermination of Jews in the USSR long after you became head of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt?
I only discovered it during discussions with Himmler and Hitler, I believe later in 1943, probably in November.
And you acknowledge, as I understand, that you were the Supreme SS and police leader in Austria in 1942, correct?
Yes.
And Schirach was then Reich Commissioner for Defense in Vienna, wasn't he?
I don't know when he was appointed, but I must point out that the Supreme SS and police leaders received the type of power they eventually possessed over 3 different stages. In 1941, when I became the Supreme SS and police leader, the powers of that leader were considerably less than at the end of the war.